There was one thing you mentioned that in the occult, self-worship was a big
Yeah,
deal.
yeah. So like, I'm not sure if it's like this in all fields of the occult. I think in most it probably is consistent, and a lot of people don't know they're doing it. Now in Thelema, we did know. When I say self worship, I don't necessarily mean like worshiping myself. So it's complex, right?
Hmm.
So self-worship being the highest virtue. So what that meant for me specifically, like how that translated into everyday life in my line of thinking. So in Thelema, so obviously there's the law. So the law in Thelema is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. And the way that Thelemites interpret that is your will, capital W, that's how it is. That's capital W will,
Mm.
capital L. So Thelema and agape, will and love, right? So your will, your true will is like this highest expression of, you know what? I'm not even going to mince words here. Let me pull this up. Will. So, and you also asked me about the Holy Guardian Angel, which we can get into that. So
Oh yeah.
this is directly from their encyclopedia. Which I don't know who this is run by, but it says the OTO. So an OTO lodge runs this. So they're the first religious body that accepted the law of Thelema. They were run by Aleister Crowley. OTO was a Masonic organization started by Theodore Roos in the late 19th century, and then after his death, Crowley superseded him as the outer head of the order, which is basically like the head of it. So the phrase true will is often used to indicate the specific and essential meaning of the concept of will in Thelema. It does not appear in the Book of the Law, and for all intents and purposes, the phrase true will and pure will, which does appear in the Book of the Law, are synonymous. The concept postulates that each individual has a unique and incommensurable inherent nature identical to their destiny that determines their proper course in life. That is the mode of action that unites their purest personal will with the postulated course that preexists for them in the universe. So the whole point of Thelema, and then love is the law, love under will means that that your true will is supposed to be in light of love, and specifically the Greek word agape, which is just a further bastardization of the
Hmm.
faith, in my opinion, and even more confusing for even the well catechized. Um, so the central point of Thelema is to achieve, first and foremost, something that's called knowledge and conversation of one's holy guardian angel. That is the HGA that you asked me about. So they
Right.
use the term the holy guardian angel. And this is another direct quote from them. The holy guardian angel is representative of one's truest divine nature. So, and then let me see here. Here is a quote from Crowley himself in his book Magic Without Tears, which is his most famous work. It should never be forgotten for a single moment that the central and essential work of the magician is the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Once he has achieved this, he must, of course, be left entirely in the hands of that angel, who can be invariably and inevitably relied upon to lead him to the further great step, crossing of the abyss, and the attainment of the grade of the master of the temple. So the central focus of Thelemites is to achieve this knowledge and conversation with this holy guardian angel, which they might believe is subconscious in nature, or some of them might. The most orthodox thing is that it's both subconscious and spiritual, metaphysical.
Mm.
But some people you can be an atheist and be a Thelemite, and all this stuff can just be like psychological, like a Jungian psychological interpretation of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in those interpretations, the rituals and everything that you do, like I mentioned, saying will and Liber Resh and the daily invocations and these postures, they're all like you're hacking your psychology in their mind. And then you have the more spiritually focused ones who are like, yes, these are all literal entities. And I was kind of somewhere between that, where I kind of believed both of those things, right? Um, and I don't think they're mutually exclusive, personally, as strange as that might seem. But that is the central focus of the Thelemite, is so everything that you do as a Thelemite, whether you're doing these yoga positions and breathing techniques, which that's kind of how you start off with. You don't just go straight into summoning demons. You're supposed to start small and get control over your body and your mind. There's like this you call it initiation, right? Like it's an esoteric system. So there's initiations into these degrees, whether somebody formally initiates you through membership of a lodge like the OTO or the Freemasons, or then there's another group called the Astrum Argentum, the AA, and some other like inner groups and things like that. Or even the EGC, the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica. You may have heard of them through Taylor Marshall's book, Infiltration. So there, the Ecclesia Gnostica Catholica is like the ecclesiastical branch of the OTO, whereas the OTO is actually a secret society. So like you actually have to get sponsors to get into all of that. And, there's secret rituals and at the higher levels of it. And they're actually open about this. You can read it on their Wikipedia page. Please don't. But at the higher levels, they do like very disgusting things that are sexual in nature. And they're open about that. I don't believe they force anybody to do it. But they openly state, like, if you want to attain these degrees, then you participate of this in free will, which, some people probably are just like, oh, I just want the higher degree, so I'm coerced into doing it and blah, blah, blah. But, I'm not sure. I can't speak to that, and I don't want to get sued either. So,
That's right.
because they will sue. Their lawsuit, they're cool with suing people. So
Okay.
I'm not going to like speak necessarily ill about them in terms of their actions, that they do anything illegal. I don't think that they do anything illegal. Maybe they do. I'm not sure. That's speculative at best. But at the end of the day, right, like when you're doing this stuff, you start with these breathing exercises, these postures. I'm waking up at sunrise every day and doing these solar adoration rituals, which are Kabbalistic in nature. And when I say Kabbalistic, I mean the Kabbalah. And I'm not saying Kabbalah with a K, it's with a Q. So Kabbalah with a Q is slightly different than Kabbalah with a K, because it's so it's not just similar, it's parallel to it. So Kabbalah with a K is like this Jewish mystical tradition that a lot of people don't know about. And that's the New Agers have like this thing they call sacred geometry. And one of the shapes in sacred geometry that they often cite is the tree of life. Well, that is the Kabbalah. That is the central focus of the Kabbalah, is this tree of life. And it is this cosmological structure of the universe and also of the human soul and mind and body. And that's a very rudimentary, elementary summary of that. It's very, very complex. And it's something that I never truly grasped fully, because it takes decades and tons of reading and a lot of knowledge that I just didn't have and never attained. Thanks be to God, because maybe if I had, I never would have turned away from it. But like this Q Kabbalah, it was filtered through the lens of a group, an esoteric group Crowley was a part of, called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in England in the late 19th century. And they there's like this amalgamation of Jewish mysticism, Rosicrucianism, which is a type of like esoteric Christianity, almost like Martinism, but it's older. And it also predates Freemasonry, and Freemasonry is also influenced by this Rosicrucian thought. But this Kabbalah that's what this is. It's like a Jewish mysticism filtered through this group, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And so this entire structure, this entire system is Kabbalistic, this Liber Resh system that is. And that's a rudimentary ritual. That's just a small one. And then they have these banishing rituals. So I mentioned the lesser banishing ritual, the pentagram, which I won't really go into that. All of these are multiple rituals, basically structured into one large rite, similar to the Mass, right? Like we have different things, like you have the washing of the hands in the Mass, you have the elevation, you have the prayers at the foot of the altar. Like, you can take any part of the division of the Mass and say this is its own ritual, but then you put it all together and it's the holy sacrifice of the Mass. It's very similar to that, right? We have these different actions that are taken towards one larger goal. And every single one of these things you do is supposed to fixate your mind, body, and soul on ascertaining this knowledge and conversation until you achieve it. And I never achieved it personally. I met people online who claimed that they had, and that they had discovered their true will. And then the challenge at that point is to find out through the trusting of that angel and other magical methods to live that true will out in your everyday life. So like when I was saying, you asked me like, what does one benefit from reading tarot cards or using Ouija boards or saying will over my meals, astrology. So for me, I can't speak for other people. For me, it was me doing even the most mundane task had to be transfixed on ascertaining that knowledge and conversation, on ascertaining my true will, figuring out what that was, why was I born, who am I centrally, not just physically and mentally, but spiritually, like who am I, why am I here, and how, once I figure it out, how do I live it out every day without ever deriving myself from that path. That's what it was about. And that's why I took it very seriously. And to me, it was a religion. It was something, I mean, I woke up with the sun. I did these things at noon. I did them at sunset, and then I did them again at midnight. And you go even farther once you have the discipline to begin doing this consistently for months, you add things, right? It's almost like a workout routine where you start out with maybe you're out of shape and you can only run just a little bit or just do a jog. Maybe you can only do a few push-ups or a few sit-ups, but eventually you're not just doing push-ups and sit-ups. You're doing burpees, and you're doing crunches, and you're doing Russian twists with kettlebells, and you're doing kettlebell swings, and you're deadlifting and squatting. And you see, like, it's compounding, and you add all these things, and then they eventually get more and more complex. And the reason Crowley was able to do it so quickly in his lifetime is because he had a large amount of money that he inherited from his family after they died. So he spent all of his money and all of his time. None of it was mundane. He was doing this every day, all day, pretty much for his whole life. He also had personal struggles like drug addictions and things like that, which he wrote extensively about, and things like that. And he ended up dying in poverty, largely due to his heroin addiction, unfortunately. Crowley was somebody who was trying to do precisely what I just described, and he was living in the last throes of Christendom. I mean, that Blessed Karl was alive during this time, right? Like the Emperor of Austria was still there, and I would argue the last Holy Roman Emperor, even though the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved by this time. But that's my own opinion. But like, this is the last moment of Christendom, the last true light of it, really. And he's doing all of this stuff, and so I think because of the time he lived in, it wasn't the 60s, but he was doing stuff the guys in the 60s were doing, and we thought was revolutionary in the 60s, but Crowley was doing it in 1906. He was doing it in prior to World War I. He stayed in Detroit during World War I in 1919. So this is a bit off topic, but not really. But when Crowley visited, I mentioned a man to you in my comments. Frater Akkad is his name. Charles Stansfeld Jones. That's his birth name. Akkad is the Hebrew word for unity, by the way. And I'm going to kind of mention something that I really want this to be known, because this has influenced my position on what's going on in the church in particular, and why I believe Crowley is the center of all of it. Literally all of it. That, like, not a drop of this isn't doused in Crowley's nasty demonic garbage. Absolutely. So this OTO that I mentioned to you earlier, they were a very obscure Masonic organization. They did not have, like, charters. So I was never a Freemason, but I know a little bit about it from what I've read online. A lot of it's very complex, especially the politics and the structure, like the hierarchy of it is very strange. But you're supposed to get charters from, like, Grand Lodges and stuff to confer degrees upon other Masons. And after Theodore Roos died, Crowley took charge. And in 1919, he visited Detroit to buy peyote from, not peyote, mescaline, which is a psychedelic drug, an entheogen. He was trying to buy this from a pharmaceutical company. I think it's called Parkfield and Sons. I'll have to find the name of the company for you, but it was based out of Detroit, and Pfizer bought them up, I think, in 2005 or something like that. He visited this pharmaceutical company to buy a drug, and while he was there, he decided, well, his friend Frater Akkad, Stansfeld Jones, was working at a bookstore called Universal Bookstore Company, and his boss, the owner of the company, was what was his name? I have to figure out his name again for you. I have all these articles on my phone because I got obsessed with it for some time, because you'll understand why in a split second here.
Yeah.
He wanted to get permission from the Lodge of Detroit to start conferring degrees in the OTO. So he tried to do this, and they told him, like, oh no, you can't, because these degrees, the rituals surrounding them are too similar to conventional Freemasonry. So he switched the rituals around and stuff like that. And I think he never was able to actually get the permission from them. Not that it ever stopped him from conferring people anyway. And another thing he did while he was there, the gentleman's boss, Frater Akkad's boss, the guy who ran this bookstore company, it was a publishing company as well, a book publishing company. He published the first public, or not the first, what volume is it? Is it volume 3? He had a journal through the OTO, right? It was the OTO's like basically their magazine or whatever. And it wasn't like a public thing that they sold to the public. It was things like this. These occult magazines back then were usually circulated through these occult groups pretty much exclusively, because most places just wouldn't sell this stuff. But it's called the Equinox, and in one of these volumes, it was the volume that was specifically Equinox Blue Journal. Let me find it. Detroit, and I can tell you exactly what volume this occurs in because it's very important. Let's see, Blue Equinox Journal. This is going to tick me off if I can't get it because it's so important. Like it really is like probably arguably the most important part of the story, because this was in this volume of the Blue Equinox Journal was published the first public manifesto of the OTO. And this manifesto was written by Crowley. And in this manifesto, he thanked certain people for being members of the OTO, being influential members of the OTO. And one of the people he thanked was Cardinal Mariano del Tendaro. Wait, is it Rampolla? Yeah, well, it's Cardinal Rampolla. That's, if you just look that up, you'll find him. He was archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica under Pope Leo XIII. And he thanked him for being a member of OTO. And there is an article from, I think it's Catholic.com. I have it on my phone, actually, and I can tell you the name of the article. It's on my Safari, and I made sure it was last night because I kept all this stuff up because I didn't want to lose it.
Right.
It's Papacy and Freemasonry, a speech made by the late Monsignor, and I don't speak French, Monsignor Jouin, Jouin, on December the 8th, 1930. And this article was published on August 22, 2005, and it's from Catholicism.com, which is run by the it's an online journal edited by the Slaves of the Immaculate Heart of Mary at the St. Benedict Center in New Hampshire, which I think they're kind of out of canonical status, if I remember correctly. So just as a full clarity. But I actually spoke to the gentleman, Brother Andre Marie, from them over the phone about this because it concerned me very much. So there's an article they also had from 1976 called Pope St. Pius X. And here's a quote from it, directly from this article here. And this is the editor's the editor's introduction. So From the Housetops was a magazine that they published prior to it getting shut down. And I was hoping that they could get me a physical copy of this, but unfortunately, I don't think they were able to. And this was from issue number 13 in the fall of 1976. Here's the quote. The learned Monsignor Jouin was alert to the impending success of the Masons' monstrous scheme. When Cardinal Mariano Rampolla, who was later discovered to have a close affinity with French Masons, and who Jouin was certain belonged to a lodge, entered the conclave of 1903, favored with sufficient popularity to become the next pope. So 1903, Theodore Roos was still head of the OTO, and it was not a Thelemic organization yet, but it was what they wanted to be a Masonica Academia, which basically is an umbrella system where all the rites of Freemasonry would exist in one single system, almost like a Catholic church for Freemasons, if you will, a universal Freemasonry, because there's different rites of Masonry. There's the Scottish rite, the York rite, the rite of Memphis Mizraim. Blue Masonry is what most Masons are, the first, second, and third degree. So when you hear Master Mason, they're usually referring to the third degree of Blue Lodge. Let me see here. Jouin implored Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria to use his archaic yet seemingly still valid power of imperial veto to block Rampolla. So this gentleman was about to become the Pope, and this Monsignor from France asked the Emperor of Austria, "This guy is a Freemason. I know he is. I have evidence of it. You need to stop this from happening." And it is clear that the emperor was in no way pleased in having to intervene with the sacred function of a papal election, yet it seemed to him an unescapable task. The conclave was that which eventually elected one of the two canonized Roman pontiffs of the last 500 years of the church's history, Pope St. Pius X. As for
Yeah.
Rampolla, it was later confirmed he was a Mason of the most vile kind, a member of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, a Masonic sect immersed in the Illuminist and Luciferian ideas of people like Madame Blavatsky, the person who began Theosophy, and Aleister Crowley. And in 1903, Crowley was a member of OTO. So that's valid. And he was an influential one at that as well. When Pope Pius X was presented with the proof of Rampolla's Masonic membership, he cried, "Miserable man." So I asked Brother Andre Marie about this and why I couldn't find any letter from Pope Pius X about it or anything like that. And the claim that I heard from him, which I can neither validate nor invalidate, is that all of that stuff was burned during that period to prevent scandal, to prevent public scandal, because this Mariano guy was Cardinal Rampolla, being Archpriest of St. Peter's Basilica under Pope Leo XIII. We all know the story behind the St. Michael prayer, right? Where Pope Leo XIII is giving mass, and then he loses consciousness and sees demons entering into Rome. So a lot of people thought that this was a prophecy. And when I came across this information, I came to the conclusion, well, if this is true, I don't think it was a prophecy. I think God was showing him exactly what was happening right under his own nose. And another interesting piece of information about Cardinal Rampolla, and there's this new book, I can't remember who wrote it. It's a woman. I'll have to look at my Amazon wish list to remember her name, but she wrote a book called about the St. Gallen Mafia.
That's right.
And then there's who do they call it? Is there another group? I don't know if it's the same group, but they call it like the Purple Mafia or something like that. But it might be the same group, in fact. But so the only pontiff in the last 100 years whose episcopal consecration, the line of succession in their episcopal consecration, can be traced back to Cardinal Rampolla is the Holy Father Pope Francis. And a lot of these members of this so-called St. Gallen Mafia, a lot of these cardinals and bishops that are members of this, a good handful, like 6 or 7 of their episcopal consecrations can be traced back to Cardinal Rampolla. So he actually mentions this influence that Crowley has, and then he goes on to say, well, some exorcists say that every marriage has a guardian angel, right? Every bishop, his office has a guardian angel. Every parish priest, his office has a guardian angel. Some people think that the devil does the same thing. He assigns a demon to that office, right? So my line of thinking is, and I don't know if it's true or not, or if there's anybody who could figure it out, or an exorcist who might be able to, put their input in on this. Is it possible that the devil could impose a generational spirit on an episcopal line of succession in order to tempt and influence people who are getting these consecrations to the bishophood by specific people? Because nobody's aware, because we know that fathers who undergo the initiation rites of Freemasonry, they incur generational curses on their families, and those have to be undone. Even after you're baptized and everything, like, those demons can still bother you if you don't actually attack them. Like, I mean, I saw that you saw my tweet from last night. I was reading through volume 2 of my Rituale Romanum on exorcism. The prayers and forms used for exorcism in the first centuries have not come down to us outside the ones in baptism. So that we don't know what the early church did for exorcism except for baptism. But exorcism became part of the baptismal rite somewhere around AD 200. That's what Father Weller claims. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, they changed it in 1974 or 72. I can't remember. No, confession was 74. So in the 70s, though, they changed it. And those exorcisms aren't there any longer.
Right.
Who else other than demons would want to prevent ordained priests from doing exorcisms? And I've heard some arguments that I think there is some validity to, but I'm not convinced by, where people will say, well, when you're baptized, you have the full grace of baptism. That should suffice for an exorcism. Well, if that's the case, then why did they include the exorcisms for 1800 years?
Yeah, exactly.
Why did they do that? It does that to me, that doesn't make sense. And you go into confession as well. When you read the old form for confession versus the new form, there are prayers that are said in the old form that aren't said in the new form.
Hmm.
And my line of thinking is this: I like to be pragmatic about it. A closed mouth does not get fed. You do not receive the graces you don't ask for, or that you're not willing to cooperate with, one of the two. So either you don't ask for it because you don't know to ask for it, or here we have clear evidence that it can be asked for, and yet it's not being asked for. So why is it that the need for exorcism is on the rise? Is it
Yeah.
just because of the occult being popular, or is that just one part of it? Is it a multifaceted issue, right? That's my question. Does the lack of asking for it in the church's prayers have something to do with it? And I believe it does, personally. That doesn't mean that the new
Hmm.
sacraments are invalid or even that they're illicit. And it doesn't mean that they aren't celebrated reverently by holy priests. It just means that we're not asking for certain graces we used to ask for, not just individually, but collectively as a church. And
Yeah, that's a really good point. Hmm.
it fascinates me because we learned in RCIA about the economy of salvation and how everything every Christian does adds to the treasury of the church through the economy of salvation. And that includes the graces that we ask for, not just for ourselves, but for all of the members of Holy Mother Church. When we receive communion and we offer during the offertory, right, in the traditional mass, when we offer things to God in that, the priest is offering obviously the host and the wine, not only for God, but for not only for him, but on our behalf as well. And we're uniting with that intention during that. But something my godfather, my confirmation sponsor, has given to me, a great gift that has really helped me, is to offer my sufferings throughout the week, like things that happen to me that were unpleasant or anything like, or that I struggle with, or sins that I've committed, even if I've confessed them. Offer those things to God, put them at the foot of the cross, and allow God to deal with them and to strike them down. It makes me
Hmm.
wonder, how many things are we not asking God for anymore? I mean, you can look at the offertory between the Novus Ordo and the traditional mass,
Yeah.
and there's so much that the priest is not asking God for on our behalf. And that's scary, in my opinion.
Yeah, and the whole spiritual life of Catholics, dropping devotions, dropping sacramentals. There's a
Yes.
whole flood of grace that we just have stopped requesting that we used to request. Just like another conversation I had with um, um, someone who left the occult, like we'll go 2 hours and we're like, wow, we just kind of still feel like we're scratching the surface.
Oh yeah. Well, that's the problem with it too. That's another big part of the thing, the danger of it, right? Is there's so
Hmm.
much. No man can disseminate this alone and deconstruct it. It's impossible. And it's going to vary between every person you talk to. In the occult, it's very different, where every person can believe a different thing, even in a system like
Mm.
Thelema. There are constants in Thelema, which no matter what Thelemite you talk to, they're going to use words like Babylon, the Great Horror, Chaos, Abraxas, which is a Gnostic term for like the Great Archon, I guess is what the Gnostics called that if you read the Nag Hammurabi. Um, there are these constants, but every Thelemite you talk to is going to have a different interpretation, even if they're initiated into, the schools of mystery through secret organizations like the OTO. Like they're going to have a different interpretation because it's an individual experience, right? Like the whole idea behind true will is it's only yours. Your true will is going to be totally different from the next person's and the next person's and the next person's. Like, so despite there being a constant, it is intimate and individual. So everybody you talk to, it could be different.
Right.
And
Mm.
when you have these conversations, I mean, I've had dinner with close friends from church who know pretty much our entire conversion story. And anytime we end up talking about this stuff, we go on for, I mean, I've had
Yeah.
conversations about it for 6-7 hours at dinner
Yeah.
tables with food and red wine. And by the end of the night, you're like, well, we could go for another 4 hours, another 5 hours, and we still wouldn't be reaching the end of it because it's impossible. And we're talking about, and a lot of it is speculation because a lot of it is lost to history, and that's the unfortunate reality is about the occult in particular, because a lot of people never catch on to this. So when you look at the image of the Baphomet, it has both male and female characteristics.
Hmm.
One hand pointing up, one hand pointing down, has both human and animal characteristics. It has
Hmm.
both worldly and supernatural character or preternatural characteristics with the fire on its head, and then obviously worldly as in the animal and the man. And what this is, and there's two words, and this is the focus of it, right? There's two words, one on the upper arm, one on the lower arm. They're tattooed on his arms. It says salve et coagula. And in Latin, that means to bring apart, to divide, and then to bring together. Divide and conquer, if you will. And that's precisely what's happening in our world right now.
Hmm.
So the old world, Christendom, is being dissolved, being done away with, and the new world is being created out of the rubble and skeleton of that old world. And I think that's why these occultists have infiltrated the church in particular, because the church has not only the infrastructure, but the structure that they wish to impose on the planet. But they don't want to do it in Christ's name. They want to do it in their own. They want to recreate the new world in their own image, which that is the most blasphemous thing the devil could ever do. The first action of God was to create the world and to create man in his image. And if the devil could distort man in his image, it would be the greatest blasphemy ever committed. And that's precisely what I believe is happening. If you look at the old, and that's what, right, the Freemasons, if you look at some of their symbology, specifically like on the US dollar, Novus Ordo Seclorum, the New World
Yeah.
Order. We hear that all the time. We hear it from conspiracy theorists, and we even hear it from politicians nonchalantly just mentioning that term, like George H.W. Bush in, what was it, 1991 in a speech? But it was in the early 90s, late 80s that he mentioned New World Order in a speech. And now you're actually hearing it from like politicians in Australia, like their prime minister literally used the term New World Order. Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago last year used the term New World Order, stating that anybody who wasn't with this New World Order was going to get removed from their positions. Like verbatim said that, so they're just out there, saying this stuff. What is the old world order? In the West, we know what that is. If we're Catholic, it's Christendom. It's Catholic monarchy. There's a reason that when all the Masons, when they had their like not Napoleon, but Robespierre and all those folks, when they had the French Revolution here in America with the American Revolution, there's a reason that they were doing away with monarchy, right? Because monarchy is the system of government that exists in heaven. And in the Our Father, we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Well, the kingdom in heaven is a monarchy. It has a king. There's a reason that the church has not only an invisible king, but a visible one, and visible princes as well, just like in heaven. And the European governments of the past modeled their own government after the churches because of our Lord's plea. And when those governments were dissolved, we lost recourse to that form of government. And instead we have chaos where every man is a king. Every man is a king in the voting booth. The question I want to leave you with, and to people who might listen to this, is in light of all of that, of the dividing and bringing together, of the dissolution of the old world order and the introduction of a new world order, what I want to leave you with is, especially Catholics, specifically Catholics, I want to address here. Why do you think that the old mass is being suppressed? Why do you think the old sacraments are being suppressed? Why is it that a priest in Chicago can say a mass with jazz and change the words of consecration, but the regulars of St. John Cantius can't say the Ad Orientem Novus Ordo, or on the first Sunday of every month can't say the TLM, or on Easter, or on Christmas, the holiest days of the liturgical year? Why is that? And do you truly think the Holy Spirit is inspiring those actions? Do you?
Yeah,
because I don't. But what I do know is this, is that I believe that the attack on the traditional rites of the church, not just the traditional mass, but also the traditional calendar, the traditional breviary, the traditional forms of the sacraments and the way they were administered, especially ordination, most especially ordination. If you look at the loss of the minor orders, I won't go too deep into it, but I just want to mention it so people actually go up and read on it. If you look at that stuff and you really ask yourself, like, is this what God really would have wanted? Or is it just something he allowed to happen? because you mentioned that in your book, that the reason, and that's, I think it's a good question. And I think it's a question that causes people to avoid the topic of possession specifically a lot is, well, why would God allow something like that?
Mm.
And it's because in spite of evil, in spite of the demon's efforts, God can sanctify us through that. God can offer us graces through that. I mean, so like, this is a controversial opinion, and I'll leave with this, that my personal opinion, you asked me about what are my thoughts on the Novus Ordo. It is valid, it is licit, and in very many places, it is reverently celebrated by very holy men. And I know holy men whose not only were their vocations formed by the Novus Ordo, but their faith itself. People like
Mhm.
you, people like
Right.
my godfather, my confirmation saint, and even my parish priest who reverently celebrates Novus Ordo. I think that those things are in spite of the Novus Ordo, not because of it. The graces
Mhm.
are the Eucharist is still there, so the graces are the same, but the tools available for us to cooperate with those graces are lessened and diluted, and that's going to sting for some people to hear. But you can literally just do a side by side comparative table reading of the actual scriptural readings and the different prayers between the two, and see it for yourself. And if you do that, and you still don't accept that the prayers of the traditional mass are clearly superior and more effective in terms of how we can cooperate with God's grace and how much of God's grace we're asking for, then all I can do to help you is pray the rosary. I can't
Yeah,
convince you.
even Pope Benedict, in one of his last major talks, was very critical of the modern mass.